Hi, in this tutorial I'm going to do a simple app. Now this is an updated version of a previous one that was done in Xcode 4, and this is using Xcode 4.3.3. Since I've gotten a lot of requests to update it for the newer version, here it is. So what our app will do is when it loads, we're going to have a little scene in here. We're going to have some custom buttons with images, and then when we tap them, our buttons will play a sound. So this is what our first part of our app will do, and it's going to have two different screens. So we're going to use a tabbed application, so one for our sounds, and then we'll have another one that is just going to run a simple animation. And to get started, we're going to create a new project in Xcode. So our project is going to be created using Xcode version 4.3.3. So if you're using a previous version of Xcode, this will not apply to you. And I can't make any guarantees that it will work for any later versions of Xcode. So you want to make sure that you're using this exact version in order to be able to follow this tutorial. So I'm going to create a new Xcode project. And the project template I'm going to choose, since we saw in the example that it was using a tabbed application at the bottom to be able to switch from one view to another, I'm going to choose the tabbed application and click Next. And I'm going to give my project a name, so I'm going to call it Simple App. Now for your company identifier, this is usually like a domain name in reverse order. And this helps to create a unique ID for your application. So you can, for test purposes and practice purposes, you can really make up anything. But before you actually create something for the App Store, you want to make sure that you have a name that would be unique to you. And you can see that once putting this in, it creates a unique bundle identifier with your company identifier and the name of our product. Now let's choose iPhone. We do have other options for iPad or to make it universal for either one. But for simplicity purposes, for now, we're just going to make sure this is set for iPhone. And in this demonstration, we are going to use storyboards. So make sure that's checked. And we are going to have it automatically manage memory for us. So we'll keep that checked. We'll click Next. And in here you're going to find a place to save your file. I'm just putting it on the desktop, and I'll click Create. So once we have our project set up, these are the types of files that we have. We have an app delegate file, and this handles loading our application. We have a storyboard file, and let me click on our storyboard, and you can see that this shows us the basic layout and how information is connected. Let me zoom this down a little bit so you can see that a little better. Right, we have a tab bar controller, and that tab bar is going to control each of our views. So we have a first view and a second view. And so we'll get into modifying this in a minute. Now when we have each of these views has files that we'll be using to code, in other words, to customize and tell it what to do at certain times, like when we click on the different buttons on our first view to play the sound. And same thing on the second view, we'll be able to set up a second view in here with some code that will handle the animation of our skateboarder. Now for each of our views, the different screens that you see, they're called views as opposed to screens. So we're going to refer to them as views. And they have view controllers. So our first view has a first view controller header file and a first view controller implementation file. And so we'll work with these in a minute to set those up for our application. And then we have a second view controller and a second view controller M file. And so those will handle any of the content that is in our second view. And if we were to add a third view, we would add a third view controller here, and then we can add another view so that we could have yet a third tab in our application. Now you can also see some other files that we automatically got in here, like first PNG and first at 2x PNG, as well as second and second at 2x PNG. And those are for the images that go on the bottom of our navigation bar. So if I zoom in here a little bit more, you can see these are our ping images. Now the at 2x is higher resolution for Retina display devices. So instead of using these icons in my tab bar, I'm going to pull in some other graphics. Now I have a separate folder that has a bunch of things already in there, and what I'm going to do is, it's called Assets, and I'm just going to drag my folder into the supporting files folder here and then release it. And I'm going to choose Copy Items into the Destinations Group folder so that it will copy them in there, and I will click Finish. And then over here, if I expand this, we can see that I have some graphics, and this will show what I have. So this is going to be at the bottom of one of the tab bars, and then the other one is the video. And then I have other graphics that we'll use for our buttons, right, and our background that will be in there. I have a folder for sounds, so we've got the audio sounds that will play when our buttons are clicked, so we'll be setting that up. I also have a default PNG file, and when you have a default PNG, this is what will load automatically when the application loads. So it's sort of like the splash screen. And then I have an icon PNG, and this will be used for my app's icon. And this PNG series is the series of images that will be used for the animation. So each one is a little bit different. And I have a separate video that shows how to take an animation from Flash and export it out into a PNG series like this. So we'll be able to access these and put them into our animation. So those are the images that are in my assets folder, and I'll put these up online so that you can also access them and use if you're following along. Now that we have these in, let me go back to our project setup, and you can see that it automatically found the default image for the non-Retina display. And I didn't make one for Retina display, so I'm going to leave that blank, but for a real application, of course, I'd want to have one so that it would look nice on a Retina display. My app icon, let me go in here, and when I drag icon PNG over here, it will pop up and say, well, it already exists in your project, but must have the name icon PNG. It'll be copied and added to your project. Do you want to continue? So when I click yes, what it's going to do is it's going to add it up here as opposed to being in supporting files, which is okay. So now it recognizes my image for my icon. Okay, next, let's go in and set up our storyboard. So in here we have our tab bar controller, and first is going to load in the first view controller, and second is going to load in the second view controller. So we want to customize, and I'm going to start by customizing the first view controller. So I'm just going to move up to this section. And first let's customize the navigation bar. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to go to, on the Utilities panel, this area over here is called the Utilities panel. I'm going to tap the Show Attributes Inspector. And you can see here the title is First, and instead of First, I'm going to call this Sounds. And instead of using their image first, I'm going to choose the one that I uploaded, which is called Audio. So now we can see our little custom icon there. And next, we have some placeholder labels or text in here, and I'm going to get rid of those just by selecting it and pressing Delete on the keyboard. Now for the background image, I'm going to choose an image view. So in the utilities panel, I'm going to come down here. I'm just going to move this up so we have a little more room. And these are the different objects we'll be able to work with in our user interface. And so this is where we can use buttons and text fields. But for right now, I'm really interested in the image view. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to drag it over here on top of my view and place it. So we have a UI image view. Whenever you see UI, that's user interface. And with it selected, I'm going to come over to the panel and I'm going to change the image to landscape, which is my landscape image. Next, I'm going to add my cow and my bee and my sun, and I'm going to make those buttons so that when we click on them, we'll be able to trigger the sound. So in my objects panel over here, I'm going to choose a round rect button. I'm going to drag one onto my view, and I'm going to set this one up. So I'm just going to make it a little bigger, and I'm going to change the image over here, and let's make this the bee image. And you can see right now it doesn't look that great with the white background on there. So what I can do is, instead of making this a round rectangle, which gives me that background, I can change it to a custom, and then that blends in there. Now with each of these buttons we have a sound that's associated with it. If I open up the sounds folder over here, you can see that there's a bee wave file that goes with our bee ping image. There's a cow wave file that goes with our cow image, horsey. Now I intentionally named these sound files to have the same names, and we're also going to give each of our buttons a title because we're going to be using this information in our code to say we want it to play the same sound as the title information for our button. So this one is going to be called B. So we'll be referencing this title in our code so that it's going to say find the same title name as there is a wave file and play that. Now one of the tricky things that you have to deal with this is if this is bigger, you can see that the title shows up in there. So I'm just going to make sure that my image fits into there without the title showing up. Now I can repeat that process. I can drag another round rectangle button and go through those steps to set it up. It would be just as easy for me to make copies of these. So if I hold down my Option key and I click and drag, I can duplicate. So I'm going to Option and click, and I'm going to put one over here for the sun, and I'm going to put one down here for the horse, and then we have this one for the cow. So now all I need to do is to customize this, to tap on it and change this one from the title B to sun, and then change the image to sun. And then I can resize it out here to make it bigger or smaller, whatever your choice. And I'm going to update each of these other ones. So this one's going to be cow, and we'll use the cow ping image, and he needs to be resized and moved around a little bit. And then the last one is the horse. Now I'm making sure that my title matches the name of the wave file that I want to use, so horsey and horsey. And it is case sensitive, so make sure that you do use the right case. And so we'll make our horse a little bigger. Now maybe what I should have done before we started this was to run it so that you could see what it looks like right out of the box. But we'll test this even though we've set this up, and then you can see if the navigation will work going to our second view. So you want to make sure that you have the iPhone simulator set up, and if it's not, you can click and hold on this and you can see the different options. So if you had an actual device that was provisioned, you could test it on a device or an iPad simulator. I'm going to make sure iPhone is selected and then run. Now if we had any errors, they would start to show up here, but it is building successfully. Okay, and then we have our buttons, but they're not doing anything yet. You can just tap them and see that, yeah, they tap, but we'll add sounds to them. We can go to our second view, and you can see that This is the default information that was there from what was already set up by choosing that template. So the navigation part is pretty much set up for us automatically when we chose that template. So let's go back in here and set up these buttons. Back in our storyboard, right, we want to connect each of these to a method so that they will play a sound. So I'm going to close this utility panel to the side again, just so that we have some more room. And I'm going to go into the Assistant Editor mode. And this opens up the first viewcontroller.h file. And if it doesn't, you can click and hold here and choose the first viewcontroller.h file. Since we have this selected, it's automatically trying to pick up the file that we are working with. So since we're on the first view controller, it's giving us the first view controller header file. And what we're going to set up in here is a method. A method is something that's going to be triggered by one of our buttons. So in the header file, we're just specifying or declaring, we're saying this is the name of our method, this is what it's going to be called. And in the implementation file is where we actually put in the code or what it is that it should do. We actually implement the method that we are initializing here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the sun, and I'm going to right click and drag from the sun to the header file and then release. And instead of an outlet, we are going to cause an action with this. So when this is tapped, we're going to have it do an action. And the name of that action, we'll just call it play sound. And it's going to be a touch up inside, which is typical for a button. And the type is ID. And this is typical for a button to use it as ID. And what we'll be able to do is identify the information about this button that was tapped. So one of the important things was the title of our button. We're going to get that information, so we'll be able to say the title of this button was Sun through its ID. And then we'll be able to match that up to our Sun wave file. So I'm going to click Connect, and we create an action here, and you can see there's a little dot that has a circle on it, and then when I hover over, you can see what it's connected to. Now, we want to use the same action, the same play sound for all 4 buttons. So I'm going to connect each of these buttons to this same action. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to select my B, and then right click and drag from my B, and I'm going to point right onto the play sound. And you can see this connect action little button that's showing what we're going to be doing. We're connecting the action. So when I release, it kind of flickers there, but now when I hover over, we can see that both of these are connected to that same action. So I'm going to repeat that for the cow. Just right click and drag right onto the action to connect it, and then from the horse to the play sound to connect it. So now when I hover over, you can see that all 4 of these buttons are connected to this single action. Okay, so now these are connected, and now we need to go into the implementation file and actually code this play sound method to play the sound that's associated with each button. So I'm going to go out of the Assistant Editor and go into the Standard Editor. And I want to go into the implementation file. So I'm going to go to the first view controller implementation file. And what we had created was this IB action play sound. And so what goes inside this opening and closing curly brace is what we wanted to do when the button is clicked, right? When the button is clicked, it's going to trigger this play sound action. Now this is all the way at the bottom of the screen, so I'm going to take this code and I'm just going to move it up to right after this implementation line, just so that we have a little more screen space and make it a little easier to see in the video. So now in our play sound, we want it to play one of the sounds that goes along with the button. So in order to do that, we need to use the system sound, and we need to add in the audio services framework. Now we automatically get some frameworks when you start a new application, the user interface kit and the foundation and core graphics. But since sound may not be in every application, it's something that we want to add in separately, only if your app uses it. So to add this, I'm going to go into the project. So up at the top of our files listing, if I click on the project, we have information about our application, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and you can see this area for linked frameworks and libraries. So we're going to add another framework for the audio. So I'm going to click this little plus sign, and you can see this is a list of the different frameworks. So we want the Audio Toolbox framework. So I'm going to click that and add. And now you can see it's been added into our framework. And so now I need to go into our first view controller header file and tell it to use or include the Audio Toolbox framework. So I'm going to go to the first view controller, and you can see here we're importing the UI kit, and that's automatic when we create a new project. But in here I need to import the Audio Toolbox header file from our frameworks. So now our first view controller class files know that we can use the framework for audio. So now if I go into my first view controller implementation file, now we can start to set this up. So first we need to get the system sound, right? And you can see it start to pop up since we added that framework. Now it recognizes the system sound ID. And I'm going to create a new system sound object. It's going to be called sound ID. Next we're going to create a string that's going to get the title of our button. So I'm going to call this button name, and I'm going to set that equal to sender. Remember, our button can send information about itself when it's tapped to our method, and so we're going to say sender current title. Now I could type it in, or it pops up with some different options, so I'm going to just double click here to say current title. Right, so this current title, if I go back to the storyboard again and I click on one of these buttons and go into the utility panel, right, this is the title. So this information is what's going to be captured back in our implementation file. Current title from the sender is going to get assigned to our string. We're going to create a second string that's going to create the name of the sound file that we want to use. So we're going to put those two things together. So again, it's also going to be a string, and we're going to call this sound file, and that is equal to ns bundle, main bundle. In other words, this is referring to files that are within the application. So we added our sound files into our application, and so this bundle is all of the files that are in our main bundle or within our application. And let's say path for resource, where to go to find it. It's going to be our button name, and the type is a WAV file, so it's going to be a string. So we do strings with an @ sign and double quotes around it in Objective-C. And this next part, I'm just going to copy and paste the code in, and then we'll do a brief overview of what it is so that you don't have to watch me type it in. So we're using Audio Services Create System Sound, right? And we're getting the name of the file with the path of our sound file, right? So we're getting the sound from here, and then we actually just play the sound. So now if I save this and run it in the simulator, we can test it. So they seem to be working. All right, so our sounds work. So next, we'll move into modifying our second view. So from here, I'm going to delete what we have in as placeholder text. We can set up our tab at the bottom. So instead of second, let's say this is going to be animation, and we have a little video PNG file to use for our bar there. Our animation is going to be in the same type as we had our background, so we're going to put an image view in here, and the image view is going to contain the animation. And let's start with our loop 1 PNG, which has our starting image. Now you can see she's a little distorted here. So instead of scale to fill, if you use aspect fit, it will keep things in their proportion so it doesn't get all stretched and distorted. Okay, now that we have our view set up, we can begin to make our connections and start coding. So to set up our outlets and actions with this, I'm going to close the utility panel and we're going to go into the assistant editor. And now we have the second view controller header file. And so this is where we're going to set up our outlet for our image view. So what I'm going to do is make sure my image view is selected in the storyboard, and I'm going to right click and drag over into the header file and then release. And this connection type is going to be an outlet. And I'm just going to give this a name, and I'm just going to call it image view, and I'll click connect. So now when we refer to this image view, we'll be able to use image view to refer to it and tell it what we want it to do. Next, we can go into the second view controller implementation file, and I'm going to exit out of the assistant editor just so that we have more room on our screen here for our code. And I'm going to add some code into the viewDidLoad method, because what we want to have happen is when our view loads, we want it to start an animation. So that's why I'm going to put that into this viewDidLoad method. So first of all, I'm going to start with creating an array of the images. So I'm just going to put a little comment in here, so array to hold images. And this is going to be an NS mutable array, and mutable just means that it's changeable as opposed to a static array. And we're going to call this array, we'll call it image array. And we're going to allocate and initialize that into memory by saying NS mutable array, alloc, and initialize. Now to initialize this, I'm going to use the init with capacity. And this is saying, okay, how much is going to be in this array? Now, right now we know that we have so many images in our animation, right? We go up to 24 images. So I could be specific here and I could put in that number. But another technique is we can define a constant. So I'm going to move up here after my import statement, and I'm going to use the define, and I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to say image count, and we'll say it's going to be 24. So this is how we can define a constant in Objective-C. So rather than putting in an exact value here, we can just say we're going to initialize it with the capacity of whatever image count is. Then that way, if we added more images or subtracted some, all we'd have to do is remember to change it here, and any place else that we refer to it will automatically use that new value. Next, I'm going to build an array of images, and this we're going to loop through since we have a certain number, and all of our images start with loop and then have a number and a .png. Rather than specifying each image individually, we can create that dynamically using a loop. So I'm just going to paste some code in here. Okay, so we're going to initialize a value I, and then we're going to have a for loop, and it's going to loop through the total number of images in our image array, and as it goes through each time until this becomes false, it will increment. So we're saying our image array is going to add an object that is an image, a UI image, and an image named, and here we're creating a string, and our string with format, we're saying loop %d, which is a digit, .png. So as it goes through here and it loops, does this for loop, it's going to say, okay, it's going to create, the first time it goes through, %d is a digit, this digit gets replaced with the value of I, so the first time it comes through here, I is equal to 1. So this will create an image in our image array called loop1.png. Then it's going to come back here and increment I, so now it'll be 2. Then it will do loop2.png and so forth until it's exhausted the number of items that are in our image count. So this is dynamically creating an array for loop 1 through loop 24. Now that we have our array of images defined, we can make it animate. So I'm just going to have some comments in here. So let's say image view, and we'll say animation images. So this is referring to an array of images. So this equals an NS array, and it's an array with array. And the array that it's going to include is our image array that we're dynamically creating here. We're going to say image view, animation duration, and we'll say that equals 5. And this is referring to the amount of time that it takes to go through one cycle of the images. And finally, we can tell it to animate the image by saying image view start animating. So now I think we're ready to test this in our simulator. And I'm going to go right to the animation tab, and here is our skateboarder animating. Now some things that you can try playing around with in here are the animation duration. If I change this to 1 and we run it again, see she moves much faster. Okay, so one last thing. What if we wanted to add another tab at the bottom so that, we started off automatically with 2, and of course you may want to have 3 or 4 and even have the option of going into more options. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to the main storyboard, and let me zoom out a little bit so we have a little more space in here, and I'm going to open up the utility panel. And in here I'm going to find a view controller, and I'm going to drag a view controller onto the screen. I'm just going to put it over here so we can see it. And now we want to connect the tab bar controller to our view controller. So I'm going to right click and drag from the tab bar controller down to our new view controller. And we can see our options in here, and this relationship is for view controllers. And now you can see that it gets added in. We move this down. And now we need content in order to manage what's in here. So we would need another controller H and a controller M file for this. So we come up to our folders, and I'm just going to right click and choose new file, Objective-C class, and next. I'm going to give it a name. Let's call this one, we have first and second, and just so that you can see that you can name these other things that might be more meaningful for whatever content is on them. So let's say this is the news. Maybe we're going to have a tab on there for news. So this is going to be a news view controller, and it's a subclass of the UI view controller. We're not worried about iPad right now, and since we're using storyboards, we're not going to create a new nib file. So we'll click next. It's going to ask you if you want to save it into your application file, so I'll click create. And then you can see over here in my files I have a news view controller H and a news view controller M file. And so now we have to connect this news view controller to the view that we have in our storyboard. Right? We added this view controller in our storyboard, but it doesn't know that it should be using these news view controller files. So with this selected, I'm going to come over into my utilities panel, and I want to make sure that the identity inspector is selected here. And for the class files, I'm going to click on this drop down list, and I'm going to connect it to the news view controller. And just to add a little bit of text to this, I'm going to drag a label on, and to do that I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. Doesn't seem to work too well when you're zoomed out. And we'll name this news. Alright, now if I run this, in the simulator, we should test and see if we have 3 views. Okay, there's our default view showing. And so we have new or sounds, animation, and I didn't even customize this tab yet, but when we get here, here is our news. And so you would customize this just like we did in the other examples. Come in here, select the tab at the bottom, go into the attributes panel, and instead of item, we could change this to news. And if we had an image in here to customize that, we would add that in as well. Okay, so that's an overview of creating a little simple app that uses custom buttons and some animation, and also adding additional views.